Over the last quarter of the 20th century, something went terribly, terribly wrong in sub-Saharan Africa. An economic crisis that kicked off in the late 70s spiraled into what many have called the African tragedy. But what was behind it? Was it a self-inflicted wound, or was Africa actually a victim of a much larger global game? Well, today we're going to investigate this compelling mystery. So, here's how we're going to crack this case. First, we'll survey the scene of the crime. We'll look at the hard data that shows just how big this divergence was. Then, we're going to line up the two main suspects, internal policies versus external forces. After that, get ready for a major plot twist involving a global power shift. We'll compare the fortunes of two very different regions and finally deliver a verdict that I think might just change how you think about all this. All right, to really understand this mystery, we first have to grasp the sheer scale of the economic collapse. So let's start where any good investigation does, with the evidence. Okay, so check this out. In 1975, sub-Saharan Africa's GNP per capita was at 17.6% of the world's average. Now, look, that's low for sure, but it wasn't a total outlier compared to other developing parts of the world. There was this feeling that, progress was possible, even if it was slow. But fast forward to 1999, and that number had just plummeted to 10.5%. We're talking about a drop of almost half in just 25 years. This wasn't just stagnation. This was a catastrophic reversal of fortune. Something profound, something fundamental had changed. So what on earth happened? And here's where the puzzle gets even more baffling. Take a look at what was happening somewhere else during this exact same period. While sub-Saharan Africa was in an economic freefall, East Asia was experiencing nothing short of a miracle, just skyrocketing up the charts. Two regions on two completely opposite paths. It's wild. And that right there, that is the central question. Why did one region collapse while the other one soared? The answer, as you can probably guess, isn't simple. To find it, we need to look at our main suspects. So let's start the investigation. Okay, so the first and most common explanation, the one you heard for decades, points the finger squarely inward. This theory argues that the African tragedy was, well, fundamentally, an inside job carried out by the continent's own leaders. This line of thinking even got a formal name, the New Political Economy, or NPE, and it was championed by really powerful institutions like the World Bank. The argument was pretty simple. African governments were basically mismanaging their economies on purpose to enrich a small, powerful group at the expense of everybody else, especially rural farmers. According to the NPE, these were the weapons used in this so-called inside job. Things like overvalued currencies made imports super cheap for people in the cities, but they absolutely crushed farmers trying to export their goods. State-owned industries were inefficient and protected from any real competition. The government was just too involved, stifling the market and destroying any reason for farmers to grow more. In this view, the solution was obvious. Less state, more market. Simple as that. But African leaders have a very, very different story to tell. They looked past their own borders and pointed to a different culprit altogether, a global economic system that was, in their view, rigged against them from the start. In 1980, the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, put out something called the Lagos Plan of Action. It was basically a direct rebuttal to that inside job theory. They argued that the answer wasn't to open up more to a hostile world market, but actually to do the opposite, to build collective self-reliance and strengthen their economies together. These were the external forces they blamed. I mean, the prices they were getting for their raw materials were collapsing. Wealthy countries were putting up trade barriers against their goods. And maybe most devastating of all, global interest rates were soaring, turning what were manageable debts into an absolutely impossible burden. From this perspective, Africa wasn't failing, it was being pushed. So we've got two main suspects, the inside job and the external forces. But what if they both miss the real story? This is where political economist Giovanni Arrighi comes in with a major plot twist. He says the true cause was a deliberate, radical change in the global rules of the game, a change engineered by the United States. So here's how it went down. In the 1970s, the U.S. was actually in crisis. Its power and profitability were on the decline, and capital, money, was flowing out of the West and into developing nations. But then, starting around 1979, the U.S. just flipped a switch. It jacked up interest rates, cut taxes for the wealthy, and basically decided to fight its own crisis by competing for capital on a global scale. And the results of that decision were staggering. The U.S. current account balance, which had been pretty stable, suddenly plunged into a massive deficit. This meant the U.S. transformed from a global lender into the world's biggest borrower. It was like it turned on a giant vacuum cleaner and started sucking up hundreds of billions of dollars of capital from every corner of the planet. This great reversal, as Arrighi calls it, created a whole new game with a whole new set of rules. That huge U.S. trade deficit meant it was buying a ton of stuff from overseas. So if your country could produce cheap industrial goods, you suddenly had a massive new market. But if you couldn't, you were suddenly in a desperate fight for investment capital against the most powerful economy on Earth, a fight you were pretty much destined to lose. Now, this explains the how the world was suddenly split into winners and losers. But it doesn't quite explain why. Why was East Asia so perfectly positioned to win this new game, while sub-Saharan Africa was so uniquely vulnerable? Well, the answer to that lies deep in their very different histories. It really starts with labor. For centuries, Africa's biggest economic challenge has been a shortage of people relative to its vast natural resources, a problem made infinitely worse by the horrors of the slave trade. East Asia, on the other hand, had the exact opposite legacy: a huge, dense population and a structural abundance of low-cost labor, basically ready to be put to work in factories. But, having labor is only part of the story. You also need someone to organize it. In East Asia, you had these long-established and extensive entrepreneurial networks, like the overseas Chinese diaspora, that were perfectly capable of building industries. In Africa, colonial policies had often actively suppressed indigenous business classes, leaving a huge gap in that entrepreneurial capacity right when it was needed most. And finally, there's the structure of the state itself. East Asian nations had centuries of history as integrated states and economies. Sub-Saharan Africa inherited these artificial colonial borders that were never designed to be viable national economies, leaving new governments with the monumental task of building a nation from scratch. It's like one region had a massive head start, while the other was starting miles behind the line. So, after all that, where does this leave our investigation? Well, the evidence suggests that just pointing the finger at one suspect is way too simple. The verdict, it turns out, is far more complex. And this leads to a pretty surprising conclusion, and this is coming from a World Bank economist. Good luck may be more important than good policies. Now, good luck here doesn't mean winning the lottery. It means a country's historical inheritance, its labor supply, its business class, its state structures. For the new game of the 1980s, East Asia had incredibly good luck, and Africa had tragically bad luck. But now, this doesn't completely let African leadership off the hook. Arrighi argues that while bad luck was the main cause, the elites still failed in some really critical ways. First, they took on way too much debt, assuming the good times would just keep rolling. Second, when the crisis hit, they accepted these really painful structural adjustment plans from the World Bank, which often meant deep cuts to public services, instead of just defaulting on the debt. And third, and maybe most importantly, they failed to shield their own people from the devastating social impact of the economic collapse. And this brings us to our final lingering question. The African tragedy wasn't a simple case of good versus bad policy. It was a story of a sudden, seismic change in the global rules that had devastating and unequal impacts precisely because it slammed into these deep, divergent historical legacies. It really makes you wonder, when the game itself is fundamentally rigged mid-play, how much can you really blame any one player for losing?